Shields play a crucial role in many Star Wars battles because they literally save lives. However, they also lead to some misunderstandings because people confuse the roles of shields and armor. Meanwhile, various types of shields have different roles, from deflector shields to particle shields. This often leads to fans describing shields in Star Wars as inconsistent when that's not quite true. I admit that the movies often emphasize drama over strict rules, however, there are usually good in-universe explanations that we just need to look for. In this video, we'll examine the main types of shields as well as scenarios that, at least on the surface, appear to break the rules. First, let's start this video by discussing the different types of deflector shields in Star Wars, because there are quite a few. Basically, shields are artificial energy barriers that typically protect starships, battle stations, and planets. Personal energy shields were also relatively common in ground engagements. The current canon doesn't actually go into much detail about the makeup of deflector shields, so let's turn to the Essential Guide to Weapons and Technology. Technically, this is a legend source, but I think we can still use it until we're told otherwise. It says that deflector shields were electronic dampeners that surrounded objects like starships or structures in an invisible protective wrapping. They could block incoming projectile and energy attacks, although they required an energy source to operate. There were two main variations of deflector shields. Particle shields could repel smaller, fast-moving solid objects, which made them very useful in space. They could protect both civilian and military ships from space debris like micrometeoroids. Star Wars Millennium Falcon, a 3D owner's guide, explains that these tiny fragments could penetrate ship hulls because of the high speeds required for interstellar travel. The invisible shield started just molecules from the ship's hull and extended around the vessel. However, as the guide also explains, they deflected objects from all directions. This meant that particle shields had to be carefully calibrated to drop for a couple of seconds when firing physical projectiles like proton torpedoes or releasing escape pods. Of course, this created a very short opening when the ship was vulnerable. Issue 3 of Star Wars Build the Millennium Falcon says that private ship owners even had to apply to use high-spec particle shields to be sure that the Imperial Navy maintained a military advantage. I should clarify that some Star Wars sources occasionally refer to concussion shields. These overlap heavily with particle shields and likely had a similar role in battle. However, they likely handled low-velocity impacts like when asteroids buffered the Millennium Falcon in Episode 5. The canonicity of concussion shields isn't 100% confirmed or explained yet. Also interesting is the fact that pod racers often use particle shields when racing to prevent dust and debris from entering their engines during a race. That's according to the source book Endless Vigil, which also claims that it was unlikely to save them in a full collision. Well, the General has been making additions to his collection for several years now, and if you're anything like me, you've probably imagined what it could be like to own a saber yourself. So that's why I started my own store called Stickman Sabers, with a singular goal in mind. Make sabers that look amazing, being inspired by iconic designs but specifically built to actually duel with. No worrying about babying them, just pick them up and go ham. They're equipped with state-of-the-art pixel technology, giving off an incredibly bright light that will light up the darkest rooms out there. And obviously have that iconic hum, just feels right the moment you switch it on. And for a limited time, if you pick a collector's saber up, you'll also get 2 combat sabers for free. So, if you ever thought about starting your own collection, this is a pretty good place to start. Links in the description, and now, let's get back to the video. Ray shields were another common type of shield that could be used separately or in conjunction with particle shields, like on Immobilizer 418 cruisers. These shields were crucial for spacefarers because they protected a ship from stellar, magnetic, and cosmic radiation. This is a real-world problem too, because radiation can trigger cancers or, in extreme situations, literally fry an organic being as well as the ship's electronics. The NASA website confirms that astronauts face higher cancer risks as well as radiation sickness from prolonged exposure to unpredictable solar flares and galactic cosmic rays. Star Wars doesn't always incorporate real-world issues. For example, every ship has regular Earth-style gravity, and most planets have breathable air. But this is a genuine spacefaring problem that they retained. Combat ships also used higher-grade ray shields to defend against laser bolts and other energy weapons. However, ray shields didn't protect against missiles or torpedoes. When they took too many hits, they would also burn out and require recharging. A ship's ray shield was also powerful enough to kill an organic being that came into physical contact with it. Star Wars Battles That Changed the Galaxy explains that the Verpine shipbuilders revolutionized ray shields after the development of turbo laser technology. Star Wars Outlaws introduced another type of shield into canon. Ion shields protected ships from ion storms, nebulae, and ion weaponry, but required a specialized generator. The scoundrel and professional outlaw Kay Vess obtained one for her ship, the Trailblazer, giving her advantages over her fellow criminals. According to Star Wars Outlaws, the Rakana Raiders used starfighters equipped with ion shields to raid from the Sama Nebula in wild space. They could also interfere with sensor scans, which was another useful benefit. Meanwhile, Timothy Zahn introduced electrostatic barriers in his new canon Thrawn Ascendancy series. These were weaker than the Republic's energy shields, but were the first line of defense for the Chiss in the unknown regions. The Nicardan General Yiv discovered this to his cost when he attacked Thrawn's Springhawk in the novel Chaos Rising. Thrawn had gotten his hands on a Republic energy shield and used it to surprise the Nicardan attackers. Thermal shields also exist in canon, but are technically just a more powerful version of standard deflector shields. They could deflect laser and projectile fire and withstand a volley of proton torpedoes. However, this absorbed half of the shield power and it took time to recharge them. The Separatist Admiral Trench paid the price for this during the blockade of Christophsis. Other shields that occur in Star Wars lore include shift shields and relativistic shields. The former appears in the official 1976 novelization of A New Hope before Episode 4 even came out. These shields protected ships while traveling in hyperspace from collisions with interstellar atoms and dark matter. In the book, Darth Vader explains to the Imperial Senate that the Tantive 4 ship shields failed during a meteor shower and uses this explanation to justify the ship's disappearance. This isn't canon, but it is a cool detail. Meanwhile, relativistic shields aren't purely defensive, but play a crucial role in hyperspace travel. Again, they only appear in legends, but they're a fantastic detail that actually adds a lot more realism. Basically, they protected the ship from a time dilation effect. Theoretically, without relativistic shields, a ship traveling in hyperspace would move forward in time faster from the perspective of an outside observer. So 2 hours could pass for the ship's occupants, but years could go by on the outside. Yes, don't worry, I'm still talking about Star Wars, not Interstellar. Before we continue, I want to do a sidebar on selective fields. These are also commonly known as magnetic containment fields and are typically used on capital ships or space station hangar bays. They're more like a pressure seal than a wall of energy because they allow solid objects to pass through. So while ships can enter or exit, the selective field still keeps the atmosphere in. Downside of this is that enemies can theoretically fly straight into the hangar bay, like when Anakin flies into the Trade Federation control ship in Episode 1. This is obviously a vulnerability, so that's why most bases like Hoth and Scarif will use hangar shields and gates because they're more secure. These are slower but more secure from enemy infiltration, although even these weren't entirely foolproof. Another interesting detail is that while they retained oxygen, they were very poor at containing heat, so hangar bays were usually very cold spaces. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that Star Wars shields are actually not as inconsistent as they may seem. There were different shields for varying purposes. Some shields were also much larger and stronger than others. So let's examine how they worked next. Many people seem to think that shields are inconsistent in Star Wars, but actually the opposite is the case. Deflector shields depended on shield generators to produce the power to activate them. This remained the same regardless of whether we're talking about a droideca's personal shield or the second Death Star. The only difference was the amount of power produced and the scale of the shield. Another constant is that they required a lot of power to activate and could overload or drop if they absorbed too much incoming energy. Basically, shields worked in a layered fashion. First, a volumetric field effect extended from the surface of the shield generator. The shield acted like a thermally conductive material. Shields could absorb some of the incoming energy, although they also re-radiated some of it back to the environment. According to the Revenge of the Sith Incredible Cross-Sections, one effect of this was that starfighters could reach hypersonic speeds when they activated deflector shields in planetary atmosphere. It's also important to remember that shields directly impact the other energy systems in a starship. We see many examples of pilots shifting power from the ship's engines to boost their shields because it's all interconnected. Deflector shield generators were produced in many sizes, from tiny personal projectors to units for capital ships. However, there were different variants as we see throughout the Star Wars movies and TV shows. In Episode 1, the Gungan army used handheld shield generators alongside shield generators on their Fambas. Perhaps the most famous shield generator protected the second Death Star in Episode 6. This was the SLD-26, and it could produce an almost impenetrable shield for an indefinite period. However, the shield's generator's flaw was its sheer size, because it was impossible for the Empire to hide. It consisted of a massive tower, a huge satellite dish, control stations, a power core, and an emitter antenna. Similarly, the rebels used a DSS-02 shield generator to protect Hoth Base. According to the Essential Guide to Weapons and Weaponry, this shield generator protected a portion of Hoth's surface from Imperial attack. This was also why the Empire opted for a ground invasion. The guide explains that the DSS-02 was a relatively common shield generator and saw use on Kessel, Fest, and Jade Moon. Produced by Kuat Drive Yards, it could even survive bombardment from an Executor-class Star Destroyer. The strength of a deflector shield depended on how close it was to the shield generator. Personal shields worked in exactly the same way. Kyle Katarn wore a belt-mounted military mobility shield that could absorb 50 standard blaster shots before it failed. It also featured self-recharging cells to boost the shield after it depleted. The Essential Guide to Weapons and Technology says that it consisted of a shield projector, cooling vents, an activation panel, a power indicator, a power housing, and a side clasp. Similarly, droidekas had personal deflector shields that even made them a dangerous foe for Jedi. Their polarized shields allowed them to fire through their shields while preventing blaster bolts from coming in. Again, this is entirely consistent with Star Wars technology. Next, I want to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of shields versus armor in Star Wars. Sometimes people mix the two, which isn't that difficult because there are so many types of both. Military spacecraft use both for full protection, and the main difference is that armor provides physical, constant passive protection, while shields are energy-based and flexible. Shields are also much lighter than armor, and with this in mind, you might wonder why very few infantry units use personal shields in Star Wars. However, standard personal shields only protected against energy bolts like blaster fire. More expensive varieties, including Mandalorian and Achani shields, could deflect melee weapons. Meanwhile, Verpine personal shields could resist kinetic, electrical, heat, and cold damage. The problem was that they were expensive, so it was more cost-effective to provide troops with armor, especially in conflicts on the scale of the Clone Wars. Personal shields were extremely popular before the Jedi Civil War, however, they became increasingly obsolete after this conflict. As Admiral Carthonasi predicted, blaster fire eventually caught up with shield technology. This meant that personal shield users required stronger generators to protect themselves. This came at a literal physical cost because they released radiation and magnetic fields that were dangerous after prolonged use. Droidekas didn't have this issue because they weren't organic beings. This made their use of shields particularly dangerous because living beings literally wouldn't be capable of executing the same strategy. There were exceptions to the rule. During the Clone Wars, ARC Trooper Commandos sometimes used portable shields on their missions. Also, we know from the Imperial Handbook that higher-ranking Stormtrooper officers also used them when on the front lines. Before 27 BBY, the Chiss even used personal shields with reversed polarity as a security feature on their homes. However, this fell out of favor because even though it fried the intruder, the radiation was dangerous. Kyle Katarn favored a personal shield on his missions because armor was heavier. However, it says a lot that even powerful Jedi like Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker opted for armor in conflict zones. It was the easiest way to protect against shrapnel and other external threats. In some cases, armor offered a superior all-around defense than personal shields. The Mandalorians sometimes used the latter, but famously wore Beskar armor. Beskar is a unique alloy we see in the Book of Boba Fett and The Mandalorian. It was strong enough to resist lightsaber strikes, as well as deflect blaster bolts. Beskar armor was almost priceless, so let's compare this to Phase 2 Clone Trooper armor, which the Republic produced on a mass scale during the Clone Wars. The Collapse of the Republic says that it cost 3,000 credits per unit, which was 1,000 more than the earlier generation Phase 1 armor we see on Geonosis. It consisted of plastoid plates over black body gloves that were resistant to impacts, heat, and acrid vapors, although crucially remained vulnerable to laser bolts. Starship armor is completely different from personnel armor because it wasn't usually the primary protection during battle. Usually, when we talk about spacecraft armor, we're referring to the materials that comprise the hull or main body of the vessel. Star Wars, the Complete Visual Dictionary, explains that capital ships usually incorporate duralloy into the hull as an extra layer of protection. They may also use durasteel, which could resist kinetic impacts, or even titanium. However, even these super dense and strong materials couldn't protect against laser bolts. This was why shields were necessary during space combat if you hoped to survive long. The Legends Complete Star Wars Encyclopedia also refers to Matrix armor, which was more durable than Durasteel and could resist a certain amount of blaster fire. You might ask how AT-AT walkers could survive blaster fire during the Battle of Hoth without shields. There's a very simple reason for this. Starfighters and capital ships have much more powerful laser cannons than standard ground vehicles or infantry blasters. The Rogue One visual guide confirms that AT-ATs have very thick Durasteel armor. This was practically impenetrable during the Battle of Hoth because the Rebel snowspeeders only had light blaster cannons. However, the Clone Wars era AT-TE had a powerful mass driver cannon that could be loaded with an array of heavy energy weapons or solid shells. This payload was even powerful enough to punch through shielded ships, as we see on Geonosis during the Clone Wars. Remember, these ships were probably not using full deflector shields at that point, and were in a vulnerable position. Their shields were also optimized for space combat, not for use in atmospheric battles. Next, let's talk about how deflector shields get taken out. You may be surprised because it's actually very consistent. Shields are usually the last line of defense between a starship and destruction. There are several ways they could be destroyed. The first and most obvious method is to overwhelm them with turbo lasers. This usually happens because the shields are not strong enough to handle the incoming firepower. There are many examples of this throughout Star Wars. For example, we see many X-Wings and Y-Wings suffer hits from laser fire during the Death Star run in A New Hope. This causes bright flashes or ripples as the shields come under pressure. Eventually, they collapse, and this exposes the vessel to devastating damage if the crew doesn't get the shields back online in time. This varies depending on the types of ships involved. For example, even a shielded starfighter probably won't take a direct hit from a Star Destroyer's heavy turbo lasers. Meanwhile, we saw during the Battle of Yavin that even an Executor-class Star Destroyer shields can drop during the heat of battle. The Executor shields flickered as it came under sustained fire from the Rebel fleet and allowed a single A-wing to slip through, with catastrophic consequences. It's a similar situation on land as we saw in Episode 1, when the Gungan shields collapsed during an intense battle with the Trade Federation's droid army. Prolonged blaster fire had the effect of shorting the Gungan shields and exposing them to danger. However, we know infantry units like droidekas or rebel cells using squad shields had another vulnerability. Typically, their shields couldn't protect against projectiles. A common technique we see in the Clone Wars was to slowly roll a thermal detonator through a droideka shield where it would be defenseless. Droidekas were made especially vulnerable from behind, so this was the most effective way to defeat them. In the new version of Star Wars Battlefront 2, Princess Leia has a stronger than average personal shield. Nonetheless, theoretically, it should have the same vulnerability because it protects against energy blasts, not projectiles. Using turbo lasers to take out shields isn't always the best option, especially if you want to take prisoners. Sometimes it works, as we saw with the Devastator disabled the Tantive 4 in Episode 4. The Star Destroyer immobilized the much smaller Corellian corvette before dispatching a boarding party to capture Princess Leia. Another safer method of taking down shields is to use an ion cannon. Ion cannons disrupt, bypass, or overload a ship's internal systems. This may be a momentary occurrence, like in Episode 4 when the Rebels fire an ion cannon at a Star Destroyer in orbit above Hoth. That shot gave the fleeing Rebels priceless seconds to escape. During the Malevolence arc of the Clone Wars series, the ship fired powerful ion blasts that immobilized Republic fleets, exposing them to capture and destruction. This was one of the most underused and wasted weapons in any Star Wars story. As I already mentioned, ion shields could provide some protection against ion fields and cannons, but they were extremely specialized and relatively rare. Some shields were almost too powerful to be destroyed by attacking them directly. For example, planetary shields like the second Death Star were too strong for capital ships to punch through. The most conventional way to target them was to take down the shield generator itself. We saw in Episode 6 how Han Solo led a strike force to destroy the shield generator on Endor. This is easier said than done because obviously it was under significant protection. The Rebel fleet bought the strike force time by engaging with the Empire's Star Destroyers in orbit before the ground team completed their mission. After destroying the shield generator, Lando Calrissian and Nien Nunb led the Rebel starfighter squadrons on an attack run inside the Death Star itself. Similarly, in Rogue One, a Rebel task force took out Scarif's shield gate. Of course, another way to punch through planetary shields was to use a super laser like the Death Stars, Starkiller Base, or a First Order Zeiston-class Star Destroyer. All of these are in canon. In Legends, we can add horrific options like Durga the Hutt's Darksaber superweapon or the Sun Crusher. All the shields in the world wouldn't save anyone from these horrendous weapons of mass destruction. The first Death Star run shows another way to defeat shields in Star Wars. Instead of attempting to knock them out, the rebels opted to bypass them. This may seem like one of Star Wars' biggest inconsistencies, and I will admit that it does somewhat stretch belief. However, the battle station had exceptionally thick armor and was covered in deflector shields that protected it from energy blasts. We know from the Rogue One visual guide, and what happened on screen, that the Imperial designers focused on defending against capital ships. They repeatedly underestimated the threat presented by starfighters to their cost. In Rogue One, we learned that Galen Erso deliberately sabotaged the Death Star by including a single exhaust port that led directly to the reactor. Luke Skywalker fired a proton torpedo through this exhaust port, setting off a chain reaction that destroyed the Death Star. Of course, if we go by what I've already discussed, this shows that it wasn't covered by the particle shield. This is likely because of its deep location within the battle station. It suggests a gap in the shielding or implies that certain sections of the Death Star remained exposed. However, there's a big reason why the battle station had this vulnerability, as we'll discuss next. With this in mind, let's talk about the last aspect of shields in Star Wars and why, on the surface, they may appear to be inconsistent. If we step out of the universe for a few minutes, it's essential to remember that Star Wars is space fantasy and not hard sci-fi. Sometimes fans become so passionate about the franchise and this incredible universe that they forget this fact. They want an explanation and background story for every single being in detail, from Imperial mouse droids to the type of boots that Imperial officers wear. They're Durasteel toe-capped, by the way. But sometimes events happen in Star Wars just to drive the story further. George Lucas and his fellow creators stretch the parameters of the galaxy so that exciting events occur and progress. The first Death Star run is a key example. Firstly, Lucas had no way of imagining the depth of lore that would develop from the 1977 movie that almost bankrupted him. Secondly, the Death Star needed a weakness that allowed the rebels even the tiniest shot of victory against the odds. If you think about what actually happens, it's not even that inconsistent. The Death Star did have shields, and even before Rogue One's lore expansion, it was still insane that the rebels destroyed it the way they did. Some of the best starfighter jockeys in the galaxy lose their lives or pull up during the run, including Biggs Darklighter and Wedge Antilles. Meanwhile, they have a fully fledged Sith Lord breathing down their necks in a TIE advanced fighter. Ultimately, Luke Skywalker unleashes the proton torpedo, but he's one of only a handful of beings in the galaxy capable of making that shot. As far as I'm concerned, that's not so inconsistent. If anything is wrong with this, it's not the shields, but the fact that the Death Star didn't have a few Star Destroyers defending it, but that just emphasizes Imperial hubris. Shields brilliantly create constraints throughout both Star Wars canon and Legends. A brilliant example is in Timothy Zahn's original Thrawn trilogy. The Grand Admiral shows his tactical genius by releasing cloaked asteroids into orbit above Coruscant. This forced the Republic capital to activate its planetary shield. The planet's governance knew that they were risking thousands of lives every time they dropped it to allow starships to pass through. This created massive economic and political tensions across the planet as supply shortages weakened the vulnerable New Republic. Another example from canon is the shield gate above Scarif. It forced the rebels to infiltrate it before they could send the Death Star plans into their ships in orbit. Shields are more consistent than you might imagine. Don't forget that there are also so many cultures and planets across the galaxy with different technological capacities. This diversity is one of the most epic aspects of Star Wars, and why we love it so much. Oh, and again, for a limited time, every Stickman Saber purchase comes with 2 additional combat sabers, so you're more than ready for your own duels. If that sounds like something you'd want to look into, the link's in the description.